All right, so this is a test of how things are working with my new setup. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a Sketchbook Pro, and this is a piece of AI art that I used in Starry Night, which is one of the AI engines that I'm looking at. So I've been experimenting with different AI engines, and let me just see if I can zoom in here a little bit. So the prompt that I had given was one that was describing a robot in an exterior environment of a manufacturing plant assisted by female technicians. So what's curious about StarryAI is I don't actually see any of these female technicians in the shot. But what I did is so I knew that there were areas that I would want to paint over, especially right in here where there's kind of a gap of the color, and I wasn't crazy about the way this kind of took over kind of the foreground, middle ground, and background. So what I did is I took it into Photoshop, and Photoshop Beta allows you to make edits, generative fill, which is tied directly to Adobe's Firefly, which is its own AI model. So by doing that, I made several different areas, and I'm just going to turn this on and off for a second here to show you the different areas. So I defined this kind of manufacturing deployment area over to the right, and this kind of pulley system also kind of middle right. The idea is that it's attaching something here, and through several sections, really what I did was I had selections that I made using the path tool in Photoshop, and then applying a slight feather on it, and in that way I was able to set up the ladder. You can see the original didn't even have this central kind of robot figure. Also adding the figure of the woman, which then I kind of painted on top of to give it a little more definition. And even once you get the elements in, I find that lots of times you need to do quite a bit of manipulation. So if I go back to the original image, I did like the fact that there was a middle ground and background area, but I just didn't like the way it was integrated, and I felt it was taking over too much of the shot. So I feel like a lot of cases the AI doesn't really give you a narrative sense. It makes the images that you ask for, it's a little bit unpredictable, maybe a lot unpredictable, but that's kind of what I like about it. And then I took those elements and I just added them on a layer and then faded them back. So I do a mix of doing them in Photoshop and Sketchbook Pro. The reason is because in Sketchbook Pro you have for me at least, it's much easier to access direct painting tools. So let's say if I wanted to get in here and start painting highlights, and I'm just going to modify a little bit the brush set that I'm on. Probably my favorite brush set is this kind of artist brush set. So if I wanted to get in here and paint highlights, it's very easy. I'm using the eye as a selector, so that's going to automatically select this color. I'll pull it over to this side so you can see it a little bit better. So I'll move all of these a little bit over so it's easier to see. So then I can just make edits. Maybe that's a little bit too small, so that's a little bit bigger. I can start to paint some highlights in fairly easily. Maybe I want the color to be a little bit brighter. Not hard to do. Maybe that's a bit too bright, maybe too much on the highlight, but I can always fix that. But I do like the immediacy of it, so I'm using an XP Pen tablet, which it's a tablet screen, which allows me to paint directly on the screen, which I find adds a certain immediacy to the work, which I can't get with another way of working, which would be either a mouse or, the iPad is a nice way to work, but of course the Sketchbook Pro runs very differently on an iPad than it does on a screen like this. So even if I'm feeling like that's a little bit too much, one of the reasons why I love Sketchbook Pro is it has maybe the best smudge tool I've ever seen. Photoshop has a smudge tool as well, but it's much slower, and it's not quite as sensitive. So I really love what the Sketchbook Pro, and this is something that's existed within Sketchbook for, I don't know, 15 years or something like that, a really long time. I've been using Sketchbook Pro for a long time, so I find it to be a very familiar and easy to use tool, very intuitive. I have a lot of the interface elements on. You don't need to do that. You can actually tab them out, which I find to be a great way to work, that you can just reduce it. And this way I can work on those highlights very kind of quickly and intuitively. I'm going to go go back into, I can't remember if I was still on Conceptual 2. I think I was. Yeah. Okay. So if you notice, I've got it on its own layer. It's not a defined layer, like I haven't named it. I do think it's important to name your layers, but in this case, I'm just making these edits very quickly, keeping them on a floating layer so that when I apply the blur effect, it's not being applied to the layer underneath. So it allows you to kind of position it directly on top, which I find to be super helpful. Anyway, I'm going to zoom back out, and you can see how this is helping out to give some definition to the way that the light is coming into the scene, because I do find that, especially when you're using the AI models, oftentimes they will get content in the correct place, and they make kind of a rough pass on the lighting. Depending on the model that you're using, it may be able to interpret the lights that are in the scene, and I don't mean like in a three-dimensional sense, but they're doing they're pulling the data on how much light and contrast are in the pixels, right? And they'll use that to get an understanding of not understanding, of course, they don't have a mind to think, but it might give you the ability to show content in a way that indicates direction of lighting, but it's very inconsistent. At least that's what I find. And so going back in and painting a little bit of highlight, to me, always kind of helps. I don't know how far I want to go on the highlights, but I'm going to back off a little bit and kind of blur this down a bit. And usually what I do is I kind of pull as far as I can on the edges, and start edging first towards where the highlight is at lower opacity, and then kind of pull up into the meatier, more opaque section. But I'm not going for realism. The image itself didn't start very realistic, but I like that you can add a little bit of inconsistency to the highlight. I feel like if it's too perfect, it's not going to look great. Like, so I never start with a hard line, even if it should be picked up as a kind of a ridge highlight. It probably went a bit too far, and I would say that when you're painting highlights, and again, it's more of a personal perspective on this, but I feel like if you go too far, it's very easy to back off, especially if it's on its own layer. And what I mean by backing off is I then reduce it. I'm using an eraser brush. This is, if we look at, it's a textured eraser, so it's not erasing every pixel. It's kind of, it has some spacing that's set up inside the brush. And so when you make a mark, if you're making individual marks, it's going to use the pen settings that you have designated, in this case for my stylus. But what I like to do is you keep the pen on the area and you kind of push a little bit harder. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Sketchbook Pro, that it's very sensitive in that way, that you can keep your stylus on the screen or a tablet, and you can just push and pull a little, well, not pull so much, but you can just push a little bit harder and get a stronger effect. And in a second, I'm going to show the layers again and back up so that we can see what this looks like. I back up a little bit, and I'm going to turn my layers back on, and we'll just see that effect. So I like the way that's looking. I feel like it's adding a little bit more. There's a few sections where the highlight is maybe too strong, so I'm just going to erase that back just a little bit. Yeah, it wouldn't carry so far into the left-hand side. I know it's not super realistic, but I like the way this looks. So this is showing that effect. So I had added a screen, kind of an interior screen overlay, and this was actually something I did within the Firefly plugin, Generative Fill within Photoshop. It made this kind of section for me and rounded the corners, which was super helpful. But then it wasn't specific enough, and I just drew some very small details in here. And for something like this, what I did, and I merged the layer down already so you can't really see it, but oftentimes what I'll do is I'll pick up the color that is shown somewhere. Like, I guess the idea here is that there's some kind of lighting inside some of these sections. Like, okay, maybe it's something like this. That might be too big. Yeah, it's pretty big. It's pretty big. It's not that far off the scale of some of the other areas. Maybe I'll reduce that down a little bit. I like that it's a little bit imperfect. It's not, that might have been too much. Maybe just reduce that down a little bit. That's fine. I'm not going to worry about it. But I was just trying to show how I had added some of those details as I used a detail brush, in this case a felt pen, and I just went in and started making marks and then reduced them a little bit more. So maybe if I want to add a little bit of feature in here. Oh, I was on the wrong layer. I'm going to use Command Z, which is going to back up, or it's going to undo the last strokes, and make sure I have the right brush selected. There we go. Just add a little bit of detail there, and I'm going to go ahead and just erase directly. Now I have my eraser set on a pretty huge setting because I've been using it on those other details. Now you could either use the eraser for something like this, or you could just back off on that layer, meaning reduce the opacity of the layer. And apologies, I say back off, I mean a few different things. I might just mean the overall look and feel of that layer or effect. And sometimes I do that with a blur, sometimes I do that with eraser, and other times I do it with a layer effect or the layer opacity. But I really like the way this is looking. I feel like the edits enhanced the metallic look and feel. It's looking pretty nice. But this is one of the ways in which you can take something that, if you go back to the original, I'm just going to merge this down and do a quick save. But the original was pretty compelling, but I feel like it needed some help to gain this kind of complexity of the story. And I'm going to go back to the original. I really feel like this added complexity, depth, and more of a storytelling aspect. That I want this to be this quality control robot, and it wasn't coming across that way. Anyway, that's how I'm using both Sketchbook Pro and then Photoshop. I know I didn't really show the Photoshop side of it, but to add depth and complexity to some of these AI images that are generated. Again, I use StarryAI for this one. All right, thanks so much.